Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us. My name is Shannon Bugas, and I am a research associate at the Arms Control Association. I'm happy to be here today to introduce Daryl Kimball, who is the executive director of the Arms Control Association. So the topic of his workshop today is on opportunities for the Biden administration to adopt saner and more effective nuclear weapons policies. Before I hand the floor over to Daryl, I just want to do one quick logistical note. After Daryl's presentation, we will open the floor to questions from the audience. So if at any time during Daryl's presentation or during the Q&A session itself, if you have a question, please type out your entire question in the chat and send it directly to me or to the host, and we will see it. And then I will read out your question for you to Daryl when we get to that Q&A. So on that, we have a lot of ground to cover and a little bit of not enough time. So Daryl, over to you.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And if I could have the organizers put the screen share function over to me, that would be fabulous. That would be good. Is that working now?
You should be able to share. Are you not seeing that opportunity?
I see one participant can share at a time.
Okay.
All right, I think. How's that? All right. All righty, I think we have it now.
Good.
All right, thank you, everyone. So it's a pleasure to be here for this discussion, which I hope will be a discussion after all the fabulous presentations we've heard about before. I'm Daryl Kimball with the Arms Control Association, and it's a pleasure for us to be part of this event from back from the brink and ICANN. As Dr. Martin Luther King famously said, the arc of history bends towards justice. But as I think many of us know, the arc of nuclear weapons history bends all too slowly towards nuclear disarmament. Nevertheless, as my friend and colleague Tom Countryman was saying earlier, we all have the power to bend nuclear disarmament history in the right direction if we work together. The long history of our efforts shows that when we work together, we can move the needle in the right direction. In this session, I want to do a few basic things. I want to provide, from our perspective, an overview of some of the key opportunities where we can make progress this coming year. Tom Countryman touched upon some of those. I'm going to zero in on a few more. What President Biden and the Congress are saying and what we might be encouraging them to say and do. Also, what are some of those, as I go along, I'll talk about some of the key political challenges. And then as we go through each of these opportunities, I want to get into a little bit of specificity about how we can advance some specific solutions in some key areas that advance specific Back from the Brink campaign goals. So, the arrival of the Biden administration comes at an important time. This year, we have opportunities to shape the debate in 4 key areas, and strong public pressure is going to be needed to achieve progress in each of these. I would list them as revamping the costly nuclear weapons modernization plan and budget, shaping that nuclear posture review in such a way as it might lead to a no first use policy or something very similar, moving more quickly along the future talks between the US and Russia on deeper nuclear arms cuts, and helping to shape the US approach towards the upcoming Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, pushing them to support a more forward-looking disarmament action plan and one that takes a more conciliatory approach towards the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Now, as Tom Countryman said and others have said, Joe Biden is an unusual figure in that he has been working almost his entire career on arms control and nuclear policy issues, among other things. And he said some very promising things just as recently as 2020, he was saying on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, "I will restore American leadership in arms control and nonproliferation. And I will work to bring us closer to a world without nuclear weapons so the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are never repeated." But of course, this is not going to magically happen. Joe Biden is going to need pressure from all of us, from his Democratic Party members, and he's also going to be facing some tough headwinds from the forces of the nuclear status quo. These are just a couple of examples of what we're facing in the US Congress today. And some of these kinds of statements are being articulated in nomination hearings for key officials. So I just want to mention this because we have to be cognizant of the fact that we don't have the Democratic caucus fully behind the agenda that all of us on this workshop Zoom call support. You got Democrats like Jon Tester, who's expressed support for the full modernization of the arsenal. Jon Tester, of course, comes from a place where some of these land-based missiles are based. And of course, there are people like Liz Cheney of Wyoming who are strongly opposed to no first use, strongly supportive of replacing and upgrading the entire US nuclear arsenal, and resistant to the kinds of arms cuts that I think many of us would like to see the Biden administration pursue. So we have our work cut out for us. So let's get into some of the issues that we might have some opportunities to make progress on. The first one I would mention is reshaping the costly plan to replace the US nuclear arsenal. The Biden administration has to address the problem, and it is a problem, of the excessive, unsustainable $1.7 trillion, $1.5 trillion, 25-year plan on nuclear modernization that he is inheriting. He has said some promising things about not needing new nuclear weapons, about reducing the reliance of the United States on nuclear weapons, and the excessive spending on nuclear weapons. That came from the campaign back in 2019. The key first step, as Tom Countryman was describing, is to put a pause on the new intercontinental ballistic missile program known as the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent. It's a $264 billion plan right now that over its 50-year life cycle. What we and many congressional critics are pushing right now is to put this program on hold. That doesn't mean zeroing out the funding, but moving the funding back to 2020 or 2021 levels, as opposed to keeping it on the current trajectory of ever increasing funding for this program. It's possible to generate, I think, support within the Democratic caucus for this. It's going to be very difficult. We're going to need the support of moderate Democrats. We're going to need the support of the president to do this. But even that is going to be very difficult to achieve. A key argument that we can and should be making is the cost savings from such an approach. If we just freeze the GBSD program to 2021 levels, that's a mere $1.5 billion. That would save $1 billion. And the Biden administration and Congress are going to want to be looking for ways to keep defense budget costs down, believe it or not, because the overall funding level is likely to be flat in the coming year. So we need to be looking for opportunities on Capitol Hill. We need to be in contact with our members of Congress in support of this approach and other saner alternatives. There is a forthcoming bill that Representative Ro Khanna of California is about to introduce that would pause the GBSD program along the lines I just suggested. There's another one from Senator Ed Markey, companion bill on the GBSD program. In addition, there's another bill that just came out, supported by Maryland Senator Van Hollen and Representative Courtney, that would zero out funding for a new sea-launched cruise missile, another one of Donald Trump's new add-ons to the nuclear modernization plan. So that's a quick outline of some of the things that we see as opportunities, and now is the time to be reaching members of Congress on this set of issues. The other key thing is, as we heard, there is going to be some kind of nuclear posture review, a review of U.S. Nuclear policy by the administration over the course of this year. It is a chance to encourage the new administration to adjust policy. And what's encouraging is that Joe Biden has said some very interesting things about this topic. As he was going out the door as vice president in 2017, he made this statement that's on the screen that he does not see any plausible scenario in which the first use of nuclear weapons by the United States would be necessary or make sense, and that President Obama and I are confident we can deter and defend ourselves against non-nuclear threats through other means. So one of the things that many of us are looking to do is to have the president, and this is a presidential level decision, operationalize that 2017 statement on no first use. And members of Congress can and have been privately and publicly pushing for the adoption of a no first use policy. There was a bill introduced last year. It has not yet been reintroduced from Congressman Adam Smith, chairman of the House Armed Services Committee of Washington, and Senator Elizabeth Warren, that calls for the adoption of a no first use policy. So I would suggest that this should also be one of the key campaign activities for folks who want to see some of the Back from the Brink campaign goals achieved this year. This is going to be very difficult. There's going to be resistance from inside the administration, from many Democrats, from US allies. We're going to need the support of nuclear disarmament activists in other countries to encourage their governments in Japan, in Europe, to support the possible adoption by the United States of a no first use policy. All right, and then another key objective is the pursuit of further cuts in the US and Russian nuclear stockpiles. As we all know, in Biden's first 2 weeks of office, he acted to extend the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty by 5 years, the only treaty that remains limiting the world's two largest nuclear arsenals. That was essential, but it's clearly not enough because the United States and Russia still possess 4,000 nuclear weapons each. They, as we speak this afternoon, they each deploy about 1,400 long-range warheads, or so warheads on long-range systems. There's much more to be done. And there's no guarantee that these talks are going to happen. US-Russian relations are very strained. The next phase in cuts is going to be very complicated because the two sides are going to have to figure out ways to discuss missile defenses. They're going to have to address tactical nuclear weapons. They're going to have to address the problem of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty being gone and the possibility of some non-deployment freeze on INF systems. That's a complicated set of issues to tackle. So, you know, one of the things I would respectfully suggest that we're all focused on is encouraging the White House, again, through our members of Congress, but also directly to the White House and the State Department, to begin soon negotiations on a further round of deeper cuts in the US arsenal. And I would suggest that we get specific about what we're talking about. And the concept of a 1/3 cut, at least a 1/3 cut in the two sides' strategic nuclear arsenals, is within the realm of possibility. In 2013, the Pentagon assessed, based upon its own perverse concepts about what is necessary to deter a nuclear attack, they said that the United States could cut its arsenal by 1/3. So basically from 1,550 nuclear weapons down to about 1,000, even if the Russians didn't do that, and still the United States could have enough nuclear weapons to hit all of the targets in Russia that the Pentagon thinks we need to be able to hold at risk. So we need to be specific about that. The other thing that's part of the Back from the Brink agenda is engaging other nuclear armed countries in a nuclear disarmament process. There was an effort by the Trump administration, a failed effort to cajole China into three-way talks with Russia. That is not going to happen as the Trump administration was proposing. Another approach we might be talking about is using something that already exists. It's called the P5 process. It's the US, it's the UK, it's France, it's China, and Russia. They meet once a year to talk about, in general terms, nuclear policy issues. That forum could be augmented to talk more seriously about how other nuclear armed countries could contribute more to the nuclear risk reduction process. So that is an important area. And yet another area, of course, as I mentioned, is, and I'm having screen issues. Here we go. All right. I'm sorry. Here we go. Another opportunity, of course, is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference. So far, the Biden administration has not said much about the Non-Proliferation Treaty Conference. This conference takes place about every 5 years. It's a stock-taking session. It's not really a negotiation, but it is an opportunity to build a consensus amongst all the states around a common plan of action for further steps they can take to advance the goals of the treaty, which include the pursuit of nuclear disarmament, Article 6 of the treaty. So the Biden administration has not said much yet about the NPT. They're still getting their act together. They're still getting people in place. They have said nothing so far on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is probably a good thing because we want them to change the US approach. So what I would suggest we are thinking about and we're working together towards is, especially towards the middle of this year, encouraging the State Department and the White House to detail US disarmament and NPT goals, to reject the negative Trump era rhetoric about the treaty and the prohibition of nuclear weapons, and to adopt a more conciliatory approach. And to give a speech, for the president to give a speech to reaffirm US support for a world without nuclear weapons, and to be a contributor towards a forward-looking plan of action on nuclear disarmament steps at the NPT review conference. And in the discussion, I can talk about what I'm thinking about there in more detail. And the other thing that will be important in the context of the NPT, where this issue will come up, is for the United States to publicly welcome the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons as a good faith effort to achieve the common goal of all nations to eliminate nuclear weapons. The United States government, unfortunately, is not going to embrace the TPNW at this time. They're not going to say they're going to sign it. But what we can do as American citizens is to encourage this administration not to be an active foe of the treaty, and to recognize publicly and to acknowledge that the TPNW reinforces the Non-Proliferation Treaty and is a welcome step to reinforcing the taboo against nuclear weapons and nuclear war. So here are the basic action steps I'm talking about. And I would invite everybody here to offer their suggestions. I'm happy to answer questions about some of these particulars. And now it's discussion time. So let me stop and turn it back over to Shannon, and we'll get started with, I think we have plenty of time for discussion.
Yep. So I got a few questions, so I'm going to bundle 2 questions together here for you, Daryl. So we have one from Michael Orgel, who is asking about how we've mostly heard about politicking and actions, but do you think there needs to be a mass movement to nudge/force big advancement on goals? And if so, how to grow it? And in a similar vein, we have a question from Peter Metz from Peace Action, asking you to talk about how to create a real mass movement of public support to the government leaders who support a world without nuclear weapons, which in his view is the only goal that will excite the public. Over to you, Daryl.
All right, well, those are simple but big questions. I'm not sure I have satisfactory answers because the question of how to build a mass movement is a complicated one. I mean, I think this event today is part of that. This is a way to contribute to building.
Now I got it.
But it can't build. It is not going to happen with one Zoom call. And I think what it's going to require is that each of us in our local communities are organizing in order to build a diverse coalition of people who are concerned about the climate, who are concerned about the maldistribution of federal budget resources, who are concerned about the threat of nuclear war, who are concerned about how we can help less uh, communities of color and in poor communities in our society, and to build these local coalitions. But we also need to work directly with our members of Congress to encourage them to take specific actions. And so what I'm trying to emphasize today is that these issues that I just described that are critical to this long-term agenda are in play. And if we are not engaging with our members of Congress, whether they're the most progressive Democrat or the most diehard pro-nuclear Republican, we're not doing our part. So we need to do both of these things at once. And the mass movement part of this is a larger question, but I think all those things help contribute to achieving that. So other questions, other points, Shannon?
We have some questions on no first use. Do you want to shift over to that?
Sure.
So we have a question from Jackie Cabasso, who says that there has been a lot of talk about calling on the US to declare a no first use policy, but not much analysis of what that would actually mean. So she quotes Admiral Charles Richard, who is commander of US Strategic Command, who commented in February that, quote, "For China, we must pay attention to PRC's actions more than its stated policies. While the PRC has maintained a no first use policy since the 1960s, its buildup of advanced capabilities should give us pause. This policy could change in the blink of an eye," end quote. So her question is, why wouldn't Russia and China view a US no first use policy in the same way? Is it likely that a declaratory policy without significant and verifiable changes in US nuclear force structure and deployments would be meaningful? Over to you.
Yeah, I mean, Jackie's right. I mean, the adoption of a no first use policy without tangible changes in how US nuclear forces are structured, what the guidance is about who is responsible for ordering a launch, it means that such a declaratory policy is not all that meaningful. In theory, a no first use policy would eliminate the need for the launch under attack posture that we have, which stipulates that especially the land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles can be launched within minutes of a presidential launch order, but not necessarily. Another thing that it implies is that the United States does not need to have certain kinds of tactical nuclear weapons, lower yield nuclear weapons available for battlefield use. But at the same time, you could have a no first use policy that still allows for a nuclear war plan that allows for the deployment of those weapons. So it is true that there's limited value to a no first use policy without changes in the force structure. I would note that the Chinese, however, have had a no first use policy for a long time. They have a long range intercontinental ballistic missile force that has, up until about now, it has not been on launch. It has not been on launch on warning status. But the Chinese might be changing their policy because the United States is deploying more military assets in the region. So, you know, I would argue the Chinese no first use policy does have value. It is reflected, has been reflected in their force structure and their planning up to this point. So it's a good question, and it just is a reminder that no one of these things is going to solve the broader complex set of problems that we've been dealing with for years and years. It is a step, I would argue, in the direction of lowering the salience of nuclear weapons in US military policy.
All right, so another no first use question before we move on to some other topics. So can you talk a little bit more about, so on your slide where you mentioned no first use, you said that we would need to, that there would be issues about allies, US allies' view of the no first use policy. So can you talk a little bit more about how to reassure US allies in going about putting in place a US no first use policy.
Yeah, so we have recent experience to learn from. You all might recall that in the summer of 2016, President Obama was looking for options late in his second term to advance his so-called Prague nuclear risk reduction agenda. One of the issues that the cabinet looked at, which led to that Biden quote I mentioned from 2017, was no first use. Word of these discussions leaked out in the summer of 2016. That led the Japanese government, the UK government, the French government to communicate directly to Secretary of State John Kerry that they were deeply concerned about the US considering a no first use policy. That had a negative effect on the cabinet discussions. John Kerry, Ernie Moniz became opponents of the US adopting a no first use policy. So, if the Biden administration is going to move in this direction, they're going to have to manage those allied reactions. Disarmament activists in those countries are going to have to be part of the solution and try to encourage their governments to take a much more constructive approach rather than opposing no first use. So that's part of the problem. I think there are ways in which the Biden administration can easily make the case to allies that a no first use policy does not in any way affect our commitment to their defense. Their defense does not require the United States holding open the option of using nuclear weapons first in a conflict that does not begin as a nuclear conflict. And Shannon, I see one question in the chat I want to answer. Deb Sawyer asked a question about a treaty that is close to my heart, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. What I would say, Deb, is that Biden is a strong supporter of the CTBT, but quite frankly, in a 50-50 Senate, there's no serious chance that we're going to get to 67 votes, especially given the other problems and priorities that Biden has to deal with. But one thing he can do is he can pursue an initiative with the Russians on test site transparency measures to make sure that no one, the Russians or the Americans, are engaging in activities that might be thought to be cheating on the CTBT. So that's one issue that can and should be pursued. That would help build support long-term in the Senate for the CTBT. But Shannon, there are other issues that folks want to talk about.
Yeah, so one more on no first use before we move on, because I think it's an important one. So from Hiroaki Nakanishi asks about the difference, can you elaborate on the difference between no first use and sole purpose? And if no first use has flexibility to deterrence, can we pursue it first?
An excellent question. What I'm going to do is refer you to an article that's about to come out in Arms Control Today by George Perkovich and Pranav Vadai on the subtle differences between no first use, a sole purpose policy, and other variations. But in short, no first use is, I would say, a more progressive, forward-leaning policy that rules out the use of nuclear weapons in certain specific war circumstances. A sole purpose policy, meaning a vaguer statement that says the United States believes that the only purpose that nuclear weapons provide is to deter an attack by another country. It is a policy that could be interpreted in operational terms as still allowing the launch of US nuclear weapons if we believe we are about to be under attack. So they're very similar. And I think if you go back and look at this statement by Joe Biden, and I can go back to, I can try, maybe I shouldn't, sharing my screen, is that he has expressed a view that straddles both. And quite frankly, if we push the president to adopt a no first use policy, it's quite possible, maybe likely, that it would be a kind of a hybrid between what we think of as a sole purpose policy and a no first use policy. That's the reality, because it's the president who articulates these kinds of policy statements.
All right, shifting over to talking about the INF Treaty. So we have another question about how rebuilding a post-INF or Indo-Pacific INF Treaty framework in a trilateral setting, so the US, Russia, and China, even if non-deployment of INF systems with Russia is achieved, how about the US commitment of non-deployment of INF systems in the Indo-Pacific region, or
Right.
introducing a ban of nuclear-armed intermediate nuclear forces with a credible verification with China?
Right. So there are several different ways to solve the INF, the lack of an INF treaty problem. Of course, the INF treaty was between the United States and Russia. It wasn't with China. I think the first priority that the Biden administration needs to look at is how to fill the gap that has been created by the exit from the INF treaty by the Trump administration with Russia. The US is currently on course to develop and build and deploy ground-based non-nuclear cruise missiles destined for Europe. The Russians already have nuclear-capable INF range missiles in the Euro region. So, one of the first topics of discussion should be to think about how the two sides can reach a non-deployment of ground-based nuclear-capable cruise missiles, medium-range, intermediate-range missiles in the Euro region. China is a more difficult problem because we have not even begun to engage with the Chinese on nuclear arms control in any serious way. There are only occasional discussions. And the Chinese have a much larger INF missile force already based on their mainland. What the United States is contemplating, as your question suggests, is the deployment of intermediate range ballistic missiles by the United States to be deployed somewhere in Okinawa, Australia, Japan, to be directed against China. That would be very problematic. I think the best approach is not to negotiate something with China over that, but for the Biden administration to drop that plan entirely, because it's not necessary for allies' defense. It would be provocative and lead to a counter response from the Chinese that would not be helpful. So that's Daryl's point of view on this. I'm just trying to focus our attention on the problem we have in Europe with Russian missiles existing that violate INF and the possibility of US missiles going into Europe in the next 3 or 4 years if the Biden administration doesn't change course. There was one other question, Shannon, I want to pick up that was in the chat that goes back to some of the no first use stuff. There is legislation relating to the president's authority to launch a nuclear war as it relates to the authorization for the use of military force. There is the Markey-Liu bill that's been around for the last 3 years that would require Congress to provide authority. Just really quickly, I don't mean to dismiss these ideas, but in a certain way, they're messaging bills meant to communicate and raise the profile of the problem, which is that the president has the sole authority to launch nuclear weapons today, even without congressional authority under most circumstances. But these bills, I think, are going to have a very hard time making it through. And this is not where our organization is putting our energy right now. We're trying to put our energy on the possibility that Biden might endorse a no first use or no first use like policy, which is difficult, but in the realm of possibility.
All right, so keeping on the topic of China, we have a question on if there is debate in Congress right now on the issue of possible nuclear arms control and capacity building cooperation with China. And similarly, can you talk a little bit more about why you view the P5 process as a good place to hold arms control talks. Yeah, over to you.
All right, well, it's a good question. I mean, there is as Michael Clare was saying in the opening panel, there is a lot of enthusiasm for competing with China in Congress, Democrats and Republicans alike. And it's a very, I think, dangerous temptation to rush forward in that direction without a dialogue with the Chinese on risk reduction and dialogue about intentions and plans. That dialogue does not exist. So one of the things that would be useful, and Michael was talking about this, is a strategic stability dialogue between the US and China that could help avoid misinterpretations. It could be a channel for dealing with crises. It doesn't exist today. That alone is not enough. We do need to have a more sustained dialogue with the Chinese on longer term nuclear disarmament issues. The Chinese right now are resistant to engaging because the United States has almost 4,000 nuclear weapons. The Chinese have about 300. Their attitude is, all right, when you get close to 300, we'll talk. Okay, that's not helpful. And I don't think they're going to engage in a bilateral disarmament or arms control discussion anytime soon, unfortunately. But this P5 process exists. The Chinese are there, the British and the French are there, and the advantage of the British and French being there is because when you ask the Russians about engaging the Chinese, they say, well, we don't mind talking to the Chinese about arms control, but by the way, we want the British and we want the French there too. So the P5 meeting has its limitations, but all five are there, and it could be augmented to become something more than what it is today, a chat session. And we have about 10 minutes, folks, so.
Sorry, I was muted. I want to turn to a question from Nimao, who says, what would you say are some of the top interventions that could promote inclusion and diversity when it comes to addressing grassroots primary challenges in this space?
That's a good question. I mean, I think one of the things that we need to do at the national level and at the local level is we need to, in our organizations, we need to seek out and make space for the younger people who are out there, who are concerned about these issues, to make space in our organizations for them to take meaningful actions and work in our programming. And as I was saying in one of the other workshops, I mean, personally, if I were still working at the local level back in Oxford, Ohio, where my mother is a community organizer still to this day, I would be trying to reach out to organizations like the Poor People's Campaign, which is an intergenerational, multiracial, multi-ethnic organization that's fighting for racial justice, economic equity, reducing the size of the defense budget at the national and the local level. And they have as part of their platform cutting the defense budget and radically reducing the amount of money being spent on our excessive nuclear arsenal. So in the time we have, those are a couple of quick suggestions. It's a great question.
All right, so I'm going to group two more questions together on two different topics, but kind of the same, kind of driving at a similar question. So on one, can you speak more about the future of the new ICBM program? You mentioned that support for ICBMs is still strong, even among some Democrats. So understanding the argument about the high cost of the new program, what other points could be made about the ICBM program, particularly to persuade some moderate Democrats? And then similar, I think we have another similar question on like talking points for some of these issues where you have to persuade people. So another question is, how do you think the Defense Department will support that further reduction of the US nuclear arsenal that you talked about in potential talks with Russia? So what are some arguments there as well that would be persuasive?
Well, let me talk a little bit about the new ICBM debate. nuclear weapons establishment, including many in the Pentagon today and the Strategic Command, they're pushing hard for the rapid pursuit of this new ICBM. Their argument is that the current land-based system, the Minuteman III, is old. It can't be extended 50 years, which is the requirement that they've set for the ICBM program. The requirement they've set for the new ICBM program is 50 years from today and 400 missiles. It's probably true that we couldn't keep the Minuteman III program going another 50 years at 400 missiles, but that begs the question, why do we need 400 ICBMs on hair trigger alert for another 50 years? So, I think we can dismiss this argument that the Minuteman III doesn't meet our requirements, number one. Number two, we need to point out that the cost of the new missile is exorbitant and unaffordable, and it's going to take money away, not just from the butter in the federal budget and real human needs, but also from defense projects that the Defense Department wants. The cheaper alternative would be to sustain the Minuteman III force longer. It would be cheaper. And we can and should phase out these land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles because they are destabilizing. They're unnecessary to deter nuclear attack. And we, as I said before, we have far too many nuclear weapons overall, by at least a third, according to the Pentagon. So those are some of the key arguments. And we do have some resources in the Back from the Brink list that was mentioned before on the website relating specifically to the ICBM debate that might be helpful. You're welcome to contact Shannon or myself for more specific resources. And as I said, there will be legislation coming out in a matter of days in the House and the Senate designed to put a focus on this idea of pausing the GBSD program, the new ICBM funding, so that the Biden administration can review whether to proceed or whether to, for the time being, extend the lifespan of the Minuteman IIIs, the existing ones, and reevaluate the need for ICBMs and to reevaluate the size of the overall US arsenal.
And then can you address the second part too that I lumped together with that one about the argument for further reduction in the US arsenal and how DoD might look at that and be persuaded to agree?
Well, as Zia Mian was saying before, we've got to understand how US nuclear requirements are set. The way it works is that the president of the United States has amazing authority to set the requirements for what is necessary to deter a nuclear attack. And President Biden has this power. The question is, will he exercise it? Or does he hand over this discussion about requirements to what I would call the Pentagon and Stratcom establishment, which resists change? So, I think we need to encourage the White House to take the lead on this review of US policy, not to allow the Stratcom people, the Pentagon, to really guide the defining questions and assumptions for this review. If the Pentagon and Stratcom is told the United States does not need 1,550 strategic nuclear warheads to destroy Russia 10 times over, and China and all the other targets that our nuclear weapons are intended to destroy, we only need 1,000, or 1,100. They'll follow orders. There may be debate in Congress, but they will follow orders. So that's what I would say about that in the time we have.
Yeah, so we have like a minute left. So I want to end on a question that some people have been talking about in the chat as well, which is, well, I guess it's a comment/question. So your thoughts on this, Darrell? We had someone say that we have a golden opportunity with the Biden administration, not only to keep the promise to reduce defense finances and modernization of nuclear weapons, but to encourage/demand his education secretary to include nuclear issues in educational curriculum of students. So what are your thoughts on taking an angle like that?
That'd be a great idea. I don't know if it's possible. The education department has enough problems today just getting kids back in school in the middle of the pandemic. But a variation on that might be, one of the things that we can all do on the local level is to the extent that we can, go to the school boards in our local districts at the high school level in particular to make sure that there is some, serious component in the social sciences portion of junior and senior year in high school that addresses this issue. And there are some great initiatives that have been undertaken by teachers and students to organize themselves and to educate themselves on this issue. There's a fabulous nuclear free schools initiative coming out of some LA public schools. That's a great model, I think, for other communities in which the students organized themselves and organized a conference with other high school students in the LA area, and they got high school credit for the conference and for the workshops on these issues. So there are other ways to skin the cat.
All right, and we came up on time, so thank you, Daryl. And thank you to everyone who joined us this afternoon.
Thank you. And here are a few resources that may be of use to everybody, including some on the new ICBM. So I want to thank everybody for your attention. I wish this was more of a conversation back and forth. Such are the limitations of Zoom and the time we have. But thanks everybody for all that you do to make the world a better place. And let's all please stay in touch.